Good morning, everybody. My name is Pace McConkey. I'm director of the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights and Education, established here at Morgan State University. We wish to welcome you to this very significant conference addressing the legacy of lynching in Maryland and the journey to truth and reconciliation. The Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights and Education was established primarily to identify and address any continuing policy or practice in schools at any level, elementary, secondary, and higher education, any policy or practice that would foster discrimination on the basis of race or perpetuate the inequitable conditions of segregation by race, and then through research, teaching, training, and advocacy, seek the elimination of those discriminatory and segregative policies and practices. We have learned that you cannot address education inequities in isolation from everything else that is going on in society, especially with respect to structural, systemic, and institutionalized racism and discrimination. So it is our great privilege to be able to join with the Maryland Memorial Lynching Project, with the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum at Morgan State University to host this significant event this morning. I would like to acknowledge the presence of former Chief Judge Robert M. Bell, for whom our center is named. We're deeply grateful that Judge Bell is with us, not only for his historical contributions in civil rights, in the law, in the judiciary, but for his continuing voice and advocacy on the issues that matter to all of us, the issues for which we have gathered here today. I would also like to simply acknowledge the presence of my colleague and research associate at the center, Dr. Simone R. Barrett, and also present, Dr. Barrett, thank you, and for all that you've done to help us organize this event today. We have two student interns at the center who are here with us today, Nasir Cook and Trey Mitchell, and we're grateful that they are here. And I would also like to acknowledge, if I still could, Dr. Charles Chavis, who is now a PhD and works at George Mason University, but was a fellow at the Robert M. Bell Center when he was a graduate student here at Morgan. So on this occasion, when we gather, it's a somber occasion in terms of remembrance, especially remembering those victims of lynching in Maryland. It is also a time for education and understanding, clearly, but I think most significantly, it is an opportunity for us to recommit and renew ourselves to address the racial injustice that is the legacy of slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow, identify them, challenge them, and address them until justice falls down like waters and righteousness a mighty stream. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you so much. I think verklempt is the word that for right now. So good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming. And to many of you, thank you for coming again. It seems like it was only a year, and it was only a year. Before I begin, I do want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Morgan State University and the Bell Center for being such gracious hosts. Mr. McConkey, especially, as well as Simone Barrett, Iris Barnes, Ellen Spokes, and Ann Schaefer, who really probably didn't realize what she was getting into when she has to do this. I thank you so much. This couldn't happen without you. And if you don't mind, I just want to take a moment of personal privilege, if that's the word. There are two people here who really made all of this possible, without whom I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have been able to have spent so much time on this for the last year and a half. Their support and generosity made this possible, and that is my beautiful sister, Barbara Gaines from Chicago, and my wife, Nancy Grace. Thank you. We have some special guests as well that I wanted to welcome. Jean Johnson, Arthur Kells, and Gloria Luckett from the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention. Are you guys here? Excellent, thank you. And Troy Williams from who is the new Baltimore County Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Troy, are you here? We're going to find him later because he's going to help us get the historic plaque up at the Towson Courthouse. He doesn't realize that yet, but. And then I believe Allie Preston is here from Delegate Pena Melnick's office. Allie, are you here? She's a late arrival as well. So I have to tell you, this past year, it feels like a dream. It feels like a dream to me. We've been able to do so much, and so much has happened. So many good things have happened for the organization and for all of us. And I just, want to review some of the highlights. When we had this meeting, this conference last year, after hanging out our shingle after 3 months, and we had this conference at the Lewis Museum. At that time, we were working with no coalitions in any counties, and we had about 40 people on the mailing list. Today, we're working in 14 counties with groups, and we have like 1,000 people on the mailing list, which is just stunning. So, and I really do think that the conference was the catalyst for all this. I think it really galvanized people. It was energizing and empowering. There's something, that's very empowering about being with people who share your goals and values, and realizing that you're not alone. We've had people coalesce within their own counties. They recognized each other. I think it wasn't even a week after the conference last year that I was already meeting with or arranging meeting with groups from Anne Arundel County and Montgomery County. And then in addition to that, I just want to review some of the highlights of the last year, and I won't take too long. But shortly after that, Montgomery County Council created its own Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, which is working now. Of course, I think one of the big highlights of the year was that we were able to get HB 307 passed, which created the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the commissioners, many are here today, and you'll notice them and you can flag them down. And that happened. We are the first, and as far as I know, the only state in the union to take that step. And I'm really proud of that for all of us. In the spring, across the street, I'm not quite sure where we are, at the, hi Lola. Glad you can make it. At the Art Center, we had a wonderful evening and performance of Janet Langhart Cohen's Anne and Emmett, that play, which was done just so beautifully by the theater department here. And we were joined by the playwright herself, Mrs. Cohen, and Secretary Cohen. So it was just a great evening. And then this fall, we've had several community remembrance projects, including soil collections for Benjamin Hance in Leonardtown, St. Mary's County, for George Peck, most recently in Poolesville in Montgomery County. And then also we're very, very proud that the EJI saw fit to install its first historic marker in Maryland in Anne Arundel County in Annapolis. So I did want to... Now, I don't know how to do this now. I want to show you, I've got a brief thing that I'd like to show you about the, some of the projects that I think you might enjoy. I hope you'll enjoy.
more than 100 officials and residents came together at the Poolsville Presbyterian Church to commemorate the lynching of 22-year-old George Peck, an African-American man who was accused of assaulting a white child. His case was never brought to trial.
Lynching, such as this, would become a hallmark of the post-Reconstruction period.
Could you stay here?
To those places of tasting wrath and tears and bloodshed, show up and let them know how wrong they are. Stand if you use that privilege that you have, use it. It's power. That's why you have it. Use it to turn this nation around. Use it to change Arundel County. Use it to make this place that you know it can be.
So, sorry about that. I never learned how to do this. I'm sorry. I blame my mother. This one? All right. Okay. So anyway, that's a lot of stuff, and that's just a year. So I think you've shown. Is Dr. Allen here, by the way? I think she might be here. Dr. Allen, thank you so much for coming. I am sorry that the sound was muddled, but we're going to have this on the website very soon. But you were magnificent, and thank you for those beautiful words. It's just been astonishing and incredibly gratifying, personally, just to be and have worked with this, not just for what we've done, but for the chance of getting to work and meet with so many wonderful people that I probably never would have met otherwise. They really restored my faith in humanity. It's just been a joy and a gift to have met so many dedicated and kind and determined and decent people. So, and I have to say I'm grateful that I've lived long enough to have this experience. So, we like to say that truth and reconciliation are sequential. And in fact, if you go to our website, the first two words you'll see are truth first. And telling the truth, I think, demands that we remember some painful and horrific things, and also that we've visited upon our own people. And we also remember the beautiful lives that were lost, and their families and friends who suffered their loss. So I'd like to just suggest that when we remember, we not only honor the past, but we really affirm our own humanity, because this is a human trait. I think none of us is so naive that we don't recognize that we still have a lot of work to do. But I think it's also good to remind ourselves that we are standing up, as Dr. Allen asked. We're here. Even if you're sitting down today, you're standing up just by being here, and that's important. We're making a dent, we're changing the narrative, and this is what social change looks like, and I thank you all, and I congratulate you all. There's, Conrad Lorenz was a zoologist, and he once observed that man is the missing link between apes and human beings. So thank you for helping us achieve our humanity together. And I'd like to introduce now Iris Barnes, our Vice President and my friend.
Thank you, Will. As he mentioned, my name is Iris Barnes. I am the Vice President of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and also serve on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission representing the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's so good to see so many people from all over the state, Harford County, Anne Arundel County, the Eastern Shore. Your presence here reinforces the fact that the work we are doing is so important and critical to the health of our communities. I'm humbled to be presenting what I think is the most important portion of today's program, recognizing the lynching victims. One of the primary goals of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to identify each and every lynching victim by name and tell their stories. In doing so, we are returning back to them some semblance of dignity, some semblance. We hope that that dignity then resonates with the families of the victims and in turn reverberates within and beyond their communities, eventually contributing to the ultimate goal of healing. Today, you will hear a lot about the legacy of lynching and its negative impact. And we want to reverse the negative trend and end the silence. End the silence. Starting with this small yet vital step that we're about to embark on. So at this time, I want to invite up Lula Beatty, Thornell Jones, and Ann Schaefer. And I ask each of you in the audience to turn to the back of your program and follow along. We are going to read the names of the victims out loud. Out loud. Let it resonate through the universe. And then we're going to have a moment of silence.
David Thomas, John Fields, Jim Wilson, Isaac Moore, unknown, Jim Quinn, Thomas Jurix, John Jones, John Henry Scott, John Sims, Mike Green, James Carroll, George W. Peck, John Diggs.
George Briscoe, Townsend Cook, Howard Cooper, Charles Whitley, Benjamin Hance, John H. Biggis, Joseph Vermillion, Asbury Green, James Taylor, Isaac Kemp, Stephen Williams, Jacob Henson, James Bowens, Sidney Randolph,
William Andrews, Garfield King, Wright Smith, Lewis Harris, Ed Watson, Henry Davis, James Reed, William Burns, William Ramsey, King Johnson, Matthew Williams, unknown, and George Armwood.
And now for a moment of silence. Would you please bow your heads? Thank you.
So, Basir, if you can give me a hand with the sound, I just want to make sure the sound is okay here, because we're going to show a little film that was finished about 15 minutes ago, if it is finished. And that's not an exaggeration, by the way. So let me see if we can find it. Come on. All right, do you have it? How do I get back to the thing?
You can minimize this.
Where?
Take it out of the brain. It's in the corner. All the way up. Yeah.
This?
Yeah.
All right, okay, thanks. All right.
Remembering the traumatic legacy of lynching in our area. Today, a group dug up soil outside the old Baltimore County Jail in Towson. They put it in a jar to remember Howard Cooper.
Cooper was one of more than 4,000 victims of racial terror lynchings in America. No fewer than 40 of these murders occurred in Maryland. Cooper was lynched in 1885, but the seed of his demise may have been planted in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. There was a major celebration in Baltimore, including a parade and a speech by Frederick Douglass.
It represented endless possibilities for the future. The end of slavery as we know it, certainly it was a way of defining freedom for African Americans. It was a way to participate in the political process.
The vote represented hope, but that hope faded when faced with the reality of Maryland politics. Democrats controlled state government for decades after the Civil War, and they were hostile to civil rights. Enter the Reverend Harvey Johnson of Union Baptist Church.
Aren't you introducing him?
No, you told me I'm just introducing you.
Okay.
Elections may not be the best tool to advance civil rights.
He not only read the Bible, he read law. He read the Maryland Constitution. He read the United States Constitution. He could literally verbatim give you the Bill of Rights. He believed that the full exercise of law was the freedom lever for his people.
He has grown frustrated with the state of politics in Maryland. He recognizes that the Democratic Party does not offer any hope. He recognizes that the Republican Party is not going to be an avenue towards change. So he begins to look in other directions.
Johnson looked to the courts and in 1885 created one of the nation's first civil rights organizations.
So the Brotherhood of Liberty is an organization that was constituted to challenge racial inequality in Maryland through the legal system.
Two early wins vindicated that strategy. In February, 4 black women won damages from a steamer company after being denied first-class passage they had paid for. In March, the state bar was forced to admit black attorneys for the first time. Then, in April, in the Baltimore County village of Rockland, a Bitcoin killer set up a tragic chain of events.
At 6 o'clock, April 4th, 1885, Katie Gray had just gone to the railroad station with her sister. Katie Gray was coming back from the railroad station when she met Howard Cooper. And she had apparently known Howard Cooper before they had roads. Katie turned, started walking home. Howard Cooper followed Katie Gray
know the truth of what happened that day. Cooper had a history of harassment. Both women testified that Cooper did accost the girl.
After about 2 hours, Katie Gray's dog, Bruno, comes running out barking and presumably chases Howard Cooper away. Katie Gray runs back to her household, and her father is incensed. Her father very quickly figures out what happened. She probably mentions Howard Cooper's name, and within hours, Daniel Gray, Katie Gray's father, puts together friends, I think it's fair to call them a mob, who scoured the countryside looking for Howard Cooper.
Cooper eludes the mob for 5 days. The manhunt consumes the county. There is no presumption of innocence. Negro guilty of fiendish assault. The excitement is intense over an outrage committed by a Negro named Howard Cooper. When Cooper is captured, he will be hung up to the nearest tree. This house is built on the foundation of a barn where Cooper hid. A friend told Howard to wait while he went for food. The man soon returned, but not with food.
Before long, 4 people jump Howard Cooper in a barn and bring him to the Towson jail.
Word of his capture spread quickly, and soon the jail was surrounded by a mob eager to get their hands on him. With the prisoner's life in danger, the sheriff immediately moves him to the Baltimore City jail. Even there, Cooper attracts a crowd.
Wherever they thought Howard Cooper might be, a mob appeared, mostly of friends in the community of Rockland.
In Rockland and the county, the demand for retribution intensified in the weeks leading up to the trial. Cooper faced charges of assault and rape. The court of public opinion had already reached a verdict.
When you look at the coverage of the newspapers, they present it as if there's no doubt that he had raped her. And why the rape charge is important is because the rape charge is what triggered the potential death penalty.
On the day of his trial, Cooper was taken to court early as threats were made on his life. Extra police were called in to handle the crush of people trying to get into the courtroom. Many threats are heard on all sides, and it is the belief of many that the Negro would yet suffer death at the hands of Katie Gray's friends. The courtroom is crowded to suffocation.
Like a lot of the cases in this period, it's hard to say what evidence there was that he actually committed the crime. He admits that he attacked Gray, but throughout the trial, he is steadfast in denying that he ever raped her. She doesn't claim rape. In the beginning of the trial, the only person that testifies that Cooper had raped her was Gray's doctor, who examined her the next day.
The trial lasted barely 4 hours. The jury of 12 white men didn't bother to leave their seats. It took them less than a minute to find Cooper guilty of both counts. The Sun recklessly named it the most shocking crime ever perpetrated in Maryland. He returned to court the next day and was sentenced to death. Cooper was held in Baltimore while his lawyers filed an appeal to the state's highest court, claiming his 14th Amendment rights had been violated because blacks were excluded from the jury pool. They knew the state appeal had little chance of succeeding, but it bought them time to raise funds to file an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
What Harvey Johnson is hoping to do is to bring this case out of the state courts. He doesn't have much hope that the state courts are going to rule in favor of him, but he does hope that if he can get a case to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court will rule on the federal level that what's happening in the state is unconstitutional.
So while the Maryland court considered Cooper's state appeal, Johnson got to work raising money for a federal appeal.
I think the possibility of this appeal to the Supreme Court absolutely magnified the intensity of those persons who felt like, oh my God, he may get away with this crime.
So when the white community in Towson ruled that the African American community was getting close to achieving its goal of raising enough money, they were up in arms.
I think it quite frankly scared them. they saw in short order that Johnson was successful in these two cases in the previous months before the Cooper case. And now they see the same person going after the Cooper case as well. And I think they're fearful that he's going to succeed in this case as well. And I think that certainly upped the stakes, ratcheted up the tension in this period.
On June 23rd, as expected, Cooper's state appeal was denied. The governor signed a death warrant setting the execution for July 31st. Cooper was returned to Towson at the end of June, even as Reverend Johnson was nearing his goal. His efforts were aided by the size of his congregation.
Can you imagine having 8% of the Negro population, the colored population, members of your church? So you're talking to them every week. And that was amazing power. And they were intellectual leaders, business leaders.
And the moment that Harvey Johnson and his parishioners pushed that fundraising effort over the limit or over the line, there's a very strong reaction by not only the Baltimore Sun, but also some of the papers throughout the state.
On Saturday, July 11th, Cooper was 20 days away from his execution. That morning, the Towson paper reported that his lawyers had already prepared the Supreme Court appeal and were only waiting for the money to file it. We think the patience of the people of Baltimore County is being severely tried in this matter. There may be a great deal of law in all this nonsense, but we fail to see where justice comes in. That same day, they got the money they needed through the instrumentality of Reverend Harvey Johnson. The appeal would be filed on Monday.
They were incensed, and they thought this brute is going to get away with it. So we have to take matters in our own hands.
But this time they've been just chomping at the bit to get their chance to lynch Howard Cooper, and they did not want to wait any longer.
The next day was Sunday, July 12th.
Rumors start to filter through the town that something is going to happen soon.
In twos and threes, men collect on the outskirts of town.
One man pulls a rope out from underneath his jacket and says, "This is a cravat for Howard Cooper."
As darkness gathers, groups of masked men converge on the jail.
The mob waits until Monday morning, actually 12 midnight, Sunday to Monday, because they didn't want to do a lynching on a Sunday.
Just after midnight, a group tries to batter the front door using a flamethrower. From the family quarters on the second floor, the sheriff's daughter directs them to the back. There, the mob has an easy time. They break the door down, find Cooper hiding under a mattress in his cell, and drag him outside with a noose already around his neck. They waste no time tossing the rope over the branch of a nearby sycamore tree. One witness says the whole affair was orderly and expeditious.
And about 40 men pull on one end, lifting Howard Cooper off the ground. He dies of asphyxiation. Usually, hanging somebody is quick. It breaks somebody's neck, but in this case, it's a long process of suffocation.
The local paper's account begins, "The Cooper case has been summarily disposed of without the intervention of the Supreme Court." At 3 in the morning, the mob had disbanded, leaving Cooper's body hanging in front of the jail in full view.
We know that a train slowed down so that their passengers could look out and see the body. This would have been about 7 o'clock in the morning. His mother came and collected his body around noon that day, put it in a buckboard and brought it to the church on Bologna Road in Ruxton, where he lies today in an unmarked grave.
That might have been the end of the story, but renewed interest in these lynchings has prompted renewed scrutiny and new revelations.
So, I went to the soil collection.
After the ceremony, historian Jenny Lyles was determined to learn more about the victim and his family.
So
here's the 1870 census. It is the 9th district, which is Towson Town. I found him in the 1870 census with his mother, his grandparents, and his twin brother.
At the time of his lynching, Cooper was said to be anywhere from 19 to 24 years old. The census tells a far different story.
So here you can find Henrietta Cooper, it says Celeste, Howard, Henry, and Howard and Henry, it's 6 out of 12, so 6 months. He was 6 months old. And by 1885, that means he could have only been 15 years old, no more. And that was rather shocking to me, that I was no longer looking for a man of 25, but I was looking at a kid.
Today, Towson is the Baltimore County seat, a legal center, and a college town. But in 1885, a child was lynched here. What we do with that knowledge, that truth, will determine the kind of community our own children inherit.
In order for us, if we're going to, have any meaningful reconciliation, any meaningful progress in race relations, we have to understand and know it's too important not to know.
Again, I apologize for the sound. It'll be on our website soon, and it really sounds much better than that. Take my word for it. I hope you could understand it. So I just want to also mention we've got a slight change of, then according to the program, the things are loaded a little bit differently, so we are going to go to the section on restorative justice, and here to introduce our speakers is Secretary of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, Ellen Spokes.
Good morning. In his comments in support of House Bill 307, the legislation which created the Maryland Truth and Reconciliation Commission, civil rights activist and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson said, by publicly reckoning with the legacy of racial terrorism across the state, a communal process of atonement can guide the necessary development of collective healing. Today, we're honored to present two speakers who will share with us practices in healing and restorative justice and what that means on a global and local level. Dr. Areshni Naidu Silverman is Senior Director for the Global Transitional Justice Initiative at the International, Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And Karen Weber is Director of Education and Youth Development at the Open Society Institute here in Baltimore.
Wherever you want to be. Here's the thing.
Thank you. So I just...
Yeah.
Okay.
Should come up. We'll find out.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Judge Robert Bell, Honorable TRC Commissioners, coalitions from around the state, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute honor and privilege for me to be here today. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then share a bit about my international experiences from other countries working on transitional justice and restorative justice. And then I'll bring it back to us here today. So, firstly, about myself. I grew up in South Africa under the apartheid system. People often ask me, what was it like living under apartheid? And at first, I would always say, no, it didn't really affect me, because apartheid was a system that was based on racial segregation, and we had a hierarchy of races. So we had whites on the top, we had Indians and biracial in the middle, and that's where I fell, and then we had blacks at the bottom of this totem pole. But then when I think back to the days of apartheid and when I was a kid growing up, I often think about things like I would sit in the back seat of the car, my parents' car, with my brother, and we'd be eating baked beans pizza. Yes, baked beans pizza. Looking out at the sea, but we were not allowed to go out. And I would ask my parents, why can't we go out? And they would not give me an answer. The other thing I remember very clearly is we would go on vacations to Swaziland, which was in the middle of South Africa, but it was an independent country. So any non-white could vacation in those countries. And we would go on vacation once a year to Swaziland. And we were driving through a province, and my dad stopped to get gas, and I needed to use the bathroom. And I was about 8 years old. I still remember this very clearly. And my dad asked the gas station attendant, who happened to be black, where's the toilets? And the gas station attendant said, it's for whites only. My dad probably had filled in 10 cents worth of petrol or something like that. I know it was cents. And he immediately told him, okay, stop, and we left. So those are the two things. But then I think about that experience, and I used to think about my friends, my black African friends, and at the same time as I was living this so-called privileged life, their townships were burning. They were fighting, they were struggling for freedom. They did not have a good education system. There was continued violence, surveillance, and intimidation in the townships. But then again, I think about this, and I think, actually, I did experience apartheid in different ways. I lived in what was essentially an Indian ghetto. I had a mediocre education compared to white South Africans, because that was the way apartheid worked. It gave us education according to the color of our skin to keep us all in our places. And the most important thing was it prevented me from interacting with my fellow South Africans, which I only managed to do in 1994 when I went to university, and that was the start of the new post-apartheid era. So why is this relevant to you all today? I'm going to show you a few pictures first, and then we'll take it from there. So these are pictures from South Africa. They're stock pictures that I got off the internet. And then these are pictures that are from the Jim Crow era here in the US. Not too different, right? So what was the difference between South Africa and here? The difference is that in South Africa, we attempted to deal with apartheid-era violations through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Whereas here, some of these violations and the history of slavery, Jim Crow-era violations have never been addressed, and so we continue to see the effects of this. So what is transitional justice? Transitional justice is a set of judicial and non-judicial mechanisms made up of 4 categories. The one category is truth-telling. So truth-telling can take the form of trials, truth commissions. The second category is prosecutions and accountability. The third category is institutional reform, which would mean education system reform, police reform, judicial reform. The third is reparations, which could take the form of compensation and community reparations. And the fourth is memorialization, which would be plaques, museums, memorial sites. While transitional justice evolved from a focus of rule of law and the need to hold perpetrators accountable, the reality, as many lawyers and judges in the room know, is that prosecutions takes a long time, and it's also very expensive. And in most cases, even in South Africa, there were very few perpetrators that were held accountable. In that sense, transitional justice overlaps with restorative justice, in that it focuses on rebuilding relationships post-conflict, post-authoritarianism, post-dictatorship, or repression. Restorative justice, according to Martha Minow, emphasizes the humanity of both offenders and victims. It seems to repair the social connections and make peace rather than retribution. It builds connections and enhances the communication between victim and perpetrator, forging ties across community that take precedence over punishment. However, this definition does not preclude justice, and I'll talk a little bit about justice later on in my presentation. What are truth commissions? Conflict, authoritarianism breeds fear, silence, and distrust. It destroys families, communities, and individuals themselves. In many countries that I've worked in, there are perpetrators who are neighbors to victims. Somebody has killed somebody's son, somebody has raped somebody's daughter, and they all still live near each other, but all of the trust in that community is destroyed. Truth commissions are often aimed at breaking the silence about the past by providing spaces for victims and perpetrators to come forward to share their experiences and rewrite a more inclusive narrative that shares multiple perspectives about the past. It isn't about blame and shame, but it is the moral imperative of setting the historical record straight. In all the countries I have worked, whether it's Colombia, South Africa, Sri Lanka, the one thing that we always hear from victims is, I want somebody to listen to my story. It may be noted that truth commissions come with lots of expectations. I'm standing here today super excited about the Maryland lynching TRC, and that's just me. However, truth commissions often do not meet the expectations of families and victims. Families and victims hope that truth commissions will provide long-awaited justice for them, provide some kind of closure about their loved ones, as well as healing. However, truth commissions are political processes and often rely on political will to succeed. The South African TRC is often celebrated as a success. However, there are many lessons to be learned and about expectations not being met. In South Africa is always applauded as ending in a peaceful transition, moving from apartheid to a peaceful transition. That's not really true. According to F.W. de Klerk, who was the president at that time, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize, I should note, with Nelson Mandela, he ended apartheid and started the negotiation process, not for any moral reasons, but because he recognized that apartheid was a failed political system. And so the South African Truth Commission was born out of these peace processes, and one of the major clauses in the peace process was amnesty. So perpetrators who committed very grave human rights violations that I will not even go into were allowed to get amnesty in exchange for sharing the truth. So for example, sharing the truth about where they buried somebody's loved one or what exactly happened to that person. And the second thing was that it also focused on bodily harm. So it focused on things like torture, killing, torture and killing essentially. And it did not focus on the day-to-day realities of ordinary Black South Africans or people of color in South Africa, some of the things I talked about earlier. This is one of the greatest criticisms of the Truth Commission, because most perpetrators came forward to share their testimony, but most of them showed no remorse. They just sat there and told their story with no feeling about it and ended their narrative. However, victims in some way were forced and bore the burden of accepting their testimony as well as forgiving them. Apart from the hearings and uncovering the truth about the past, Truth Commission's most significant work lies in the recommendations that they make. The South African Truth Commission did an excellent job of making recommendations because it recognized, it did say that it focused on bodily harm, but it also recognized that all Black South Africans were victims of the system. So it made individual recommendations as well as community and holistic reparations to address all those other victims that were not acknowledged. However, as I said, it needed political will, and very few of these recommendations were implemented. Over 20 years now, victims are still fighting for reparations. Despite many shortcomings and a range of factors that affect the final outcome of the Truth Commission, what the Truth Commission did do was it allowed the truth about the past to be revealed. Bystanders were held accountable. People who denied that these things happened in South Africa could no longer deny it because it was now open in the public. And just to say, it was by no means a victim's narrative. It wasn't, we as Black South Africans are victorious and we've now shown everybody a point. It was about recognizing and taking responsibility for actions of some groups and how other groups have benefited and had continued to benefit against those that were discriminated by a racist system. Reparations. Reparations are often synonymous, particularly in the US, with compensation and money. However, reparations can take multiple forms. It can be compensation or individual grants. It can be community reparations, such as an increase in social services for disadvantaged and discriminated groups, scholarships for children of survivors and victims, increase in job creation and activity opportunities, and psychosocial support. It could also take the form of symbolic reparations, such as the renaming of public facilities, memorials, memory projects, and museums. Most Truth Commissions, such as the South African and the Liberia Truth Commission, have opted for a holistic approach, recommending multiple forms of reparations to meet the different victims' needs. Other truth-telling mechanisms, such as those in Rwanda and Cambodia, because these were mass atrocities against a group of people, and they couldn't provide reparations for each one of those individuals, recommended community reparations as well as memorialization to address some of victims' needs. The issue of reparations, whether it is for slavery in the US or for women in Sri Lanka whose husbands were forcefully abducted and disappeared, is very contested. Questions of who should pay reparations, how to determine beneficiaries, and what type of reparations should be delivered are complicated but not insurmountable. While the contestation is more about the fact that somebody is getting resources, for victims it is acknowledgement, but also, as some experts note, a way to renew the social contract with the state and be reintegrated into society. In the criminal justice arena, people often talk about the concept of proportionality, where the punishment should be proportional to the crime. In transitional justice processes, however, we cannot apply that concept because there is no way that any amount of money, any type of community reparations is going to make up for somebody who was lynched or killed. For example, this banner was taken from a refugee camp, a Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. These people escaped Myanmar, and they saw their loved ones being killed, burnt in piles, in masses. They saw women of their community being gang raped, and there's nothing that can repair that. There's nothing that can. I met a 12-year-old boy who saw what happened. There's nothing that will take away that memory from him. But what would help in some way is some kind of justice. Institutional reform. Violence, human rights, and equality, when it takes place over a long period of time, becomes entrenched in a culture. It becomes institutionalized into different systems, such as the judicial system, police, education. In some countries, there's something called a vetting process, where anybody who runs for office, for example, cannot be somebody who committed a human rights violation. However, things like vetting and lustration is extremely expensive to embark on. Some countries, such as in Liberia and in Sri Lanka right now today, they're having their election, and there are people running for office who have been accused of crimes against humanity. However, there are various ways to reform the system. For example, there could be ongoing human rights education, anti-racism training. There could be a revised education curriculum that focuses on parts of history that are unknown. However, these types of reforms, even though they can be done fairly quickly and cheaply, also require political will and time to change a culture. Here you would see, these are murals being painted by victims that were victims of the military in Peru. And so here you will see they're sharing basically the experience of how the military attacked their village. Memorialization. Memorialization also falls within the scope of symbolic reparations. It can often be done cheaply. It can be done through memory projects, but it could also be done more expensive through monuments and museums. It can be done through any phase of the project. So, for example, the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation in West Africa started a memorialization project that went across the country so that they raised awareness that the Truth Commission was going to happen, but they also kept this archive of what people hoped for in their files for future generations. Memorialization is a process. It allows groups of people to come together and share their ideas and have a dialogue about a particular issue. It's often non-threatening and is considered a good way to address difficult issues. However, it does point to accountability. And in the US, we've seen this with the Confederate flags, with some of the monuments in the South that were taken down, and the kinds of reactions that we got. However, even though memorialization can be done cheaply, it should be done in conjunction with other forms of reparations. So, if I do not have food, I do not have basic services in my community, a plaque is not going to change anything in my life. So whatever memorialization initiatives happen need to happen in conjunction with other things. Finally, I wanted to talk about justice. And justice in different contexts means different things. Often when we ask victims about what they believe to be justice, they would say to us that justice is knowing where my loved one is. Nobody wants to see somebody prosecuted. I think often us as elite want to see prosecutions happen. But ordinary people on the street want to know where their loved ones are. They want to see the remains of their loved ones who went missing. They want their stories to be heard. They want reparations. So why is all this relevant to you? This is a picture of an artist's house that was taken on the 31st of October in Brooklyn. The artist lived in Bed-Stuy. For those of you who know Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy used to be previously African-American population, low income, that has become increasingly gentrified. This artist belongs to a co-op in Brooklyn. And there was a huge outcry about this because her house is opposite the school. And as you can see, these look like little kids being lynched. And so she finally took it down and she's resigned from the co-op. Why is something this blind still happening in this day and age? The reality is that slavery, followed by Jim Crow, and how these have become institutionalized into our culture right now, has not become part of a national public imagination. So South Africa focused on 4 types of truth. The one was forensics truth, which was factual. The second was personal truth, so it was my truth, me sharing my truth and recollecting an event. The third one was a social truth, which it was a truth that was established through interaction and dialogue. And the fourth was a healing or restorative truth. What society decided was the truth after the truth and reconciliation process, and deciding how they could move forward towards reconciliation. The reality is that the US has not had the opportunity to establish a social truth, let alone any kind of healing truth. Part of it is related to the general lack of political will when it comes to what is seen as a minority issue. It was only until 2008, 43 years after the civil rights movement, civil rights laws were passed, that the US Senate apologized for slavery, noting that the apology precluded any claim for reparations. Part of it is the insidious nature of racism and the history of white privilege and the power and the black subordination that constantly casts a shadow on the interaction in the US. What would a Truth Commission do in this current context? It will help us to rewrite a more inclusive history. We saw in the video earlier that Howard Cooper was 15 years old, and before he even stood trial, the media had already accused him of being guilty. It's not too different from today. We still see young black men being accused of things in the media before they are even given a fair trial. It will also prevent denialism. It will stifle narratives of meritocracy and offer opportunities to shape this country's past, present, and future. It will provide opportunities for healing of self and of society. through a dialogue of race and racism and how the past continues to live in the present. It allows a space for Americans, all Americans, to hold space for each other, uphold each other's voices in a collective process that could begin the process of healing. Finally, it will help build a culture that respects human rights and dignity for all. Black Americans will be included into a broader citizenry. Black bodies will no longer be seen as sites of violence, as sites of fear. Just finally, a few lessons that I've summarized from my presentation for the Commission. One is spend lots of time raising awareness, and it is collective ownership that's going to ensure the success of the Commission. While the Commission focuses on lynching, it needs to look at the root causes of lynching. It needs to manage expectation, allow access, and show its relevance to today. Even though these are historic crimes that are being investigated, the findings and recommendations should relate to today. It needs to help create a dialogue and national public discussion. It needs to make recommendations that are creative and cost-effective for short, medium, and long-term implementation. How can these findings become part of the social and political consciousness within the state? That's something to think about. There was the Greensboro Truth Commission previously in the US, but this is a historic model because it's supported by the state of Maryland, and it can become a model of truth-telling throughout the country. So think about ways for how you can share and publicize your lessons. I leave you with these two quotes, but finally, I also want to say that in South Africa, we have a concept called Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. So my humanity, because you recognize my humanity, I am human. And that is the crux of a restorative justice process. Thank you.
Hello again, I'm Karen Weber, just to reintroduce myself briefly. And I work for the Open Society Institute in Baltimore. It's a Soros foundation. We're the only city-based Soros foundation in the world, actually. Soros is in 74 different countries around the globe, and we borrow practices from one another. But my focus is pretty hyper-localized here in Baltimore. These are the areas that we work on: criminal juvenile justice, addiction, and health equity. I work on education and youth development, and we also have a fellowships program that many of you may be familiar with. But why are we in Baltimore? It's a predominantly African-American city. There's a growing immigration of Latinx, newly immigrated Latinx folks. Our poverty level is twice the national average, but unknown to what people think, it's 24%. It's not the 100% that is portrayed in the media. It's historically and intentionally segregated. The schools are underfunded, and so are our neighborhoods. Our school system is 90% people of color, 80% African American, 10% Latinx. We know that we have a history of over-policing, mass incarceration, criminalization of drug use, and overuse of punishment in schools. So we have a lot of problems. But I will say this one thing about Baltimore, it's representative of many of our urban areas throughout the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the programs we're instituting, and that's restorative practices throughout our school system. Back in 2017, the school board of Baltimore City declared that it was going to become a restorative practices district. They said we were. And so we are helping to try to make that a reality, because there's usually a very big gap between policy and actual application. And so it was. So we have spoken about the overuse of suspensions. Black students in Maryland, not just in Baltimore, are 3 times more likely to be suspended for similar behavior as their white peers. The overuse of arrests were egregious. Just a few years ago, upwards of 1,000 students per year were being arrested just in Baltimore City alone. So what did we do? We moved into 15 schools and created restorative practices schools. And when I say created, it's a long process. It doesn't happen in a year. But within a year, we saw that suspensions decreased by 44% in just 1 year of use of restorative practices. Thank you. And what happened with school police? Akil Ham, I don't know if many of you know him. He is amazing. He's progressive. And as soon as he came in to his position, he gave me a call. And he was like, what is the single most impactful thing you did in your time as an educator to change the trajectory of our young people? And I said, it's restorative practices, hands down. And so he had each of his police officers, 100 police officers, trained in restorative practices, and he even had trainers trained so that new people who came on board would also be trained in restorative practices. So that 1,000 students that used to happen just a few years ago, last year it was 50. And so we see many uses for restorative practices. Z. Cohen is introducing a bill to heal our cities, to say affirmatively that we need to become a healing city. We don't need to just have this jewel happening in our school system, because the communities and the schools are all allied. They're all annexed. So one of the things that we're doing right now is talking to Safe Streets so that we can begin to help take the public health approach to violence. Safe Streets already uses a restorative model, but it became important to have them use the same language that everybody else is using. And so the goal is to spread it, not just to Safe Streets or to schools, but definitely to law enforcement. Somebody help me. And also to branch out and go into other school districts throughout Maryland. There is a commission looking at restorative practices as a statewide model, and so we're pushing in every way we can, but we need everyone's help. The latest thing that happened, and it just so happened, I went to a conference and I was a panelist, and one of the folks in the audience was using restorative practices to do truth and reconciliation in Bermuda. Now, they have had a long history of slavery, and many of the islands have buried their histories of slavery. And this group of people has come to the fore with restorative practices to have not just the truth-telling, but the reconciliation in a restorative justice methodology. So before I end, and I am going to take the shortest time, I hope, because I do want us to have Q&A, if that's at all possible, but I just wanted to show you a short clip of a restorative circle in a Baltimore City public school. Now, I'll say, just to frame the short clip, that it's not representative. It's not, most of our classrooms are African American, and this is a very integrated school, but it's some of the things that the children said in the circle that I wanted you to have a look at. And think about the fact that a camera is there in the room watching their every move, and this is how comfortable they've become using a restorative model. There are 2 schools in our district right now who've been using restorative practices for 12 years. Those schools are amazing. That's City Springs Elementary Middle School, Hampstead Hill Elementary Middle School, and we want all schools to get to that place. So I'll show you this clip right now.
I think something's more personal, but my dad getting married, because I was okay with it, but it was still kind of hard just to come to terms also with my parents just getting like the divorce agreement, and it was just hard, and now we're waiting for my step-siblings for the documents to get here so that they can officially.
I'm so sorry, I just wanted to put more context. The question that the teacher asked is, what is a challenge that you encountered during 6th grade, and how did you overcome that challenge? Just a check-in circle where people are standing around talking about their 6th grade year.
Some things more personal, but my dad getting married, because I was okay with it, but it was still kind of hard just to come to terms also with my parents just getting like the divorce agreement, and it was just hard, and now we're waiting for my step-siblings for the documents to get here so that they can officially live with us.
A challenge that I had during the school year 6th grade is balancing my homework with other stuff. I persevered by going to culture class.
Well, one struggle I had in 6th grade was keeping my leadership percentage up, so like not getting in trouble, because in the beginning of the year I was getting in a lot of trouble, and my percentage was really low, and I missed out on like 3 trips, but then I started to like pay attention in class more and not get in trouble, and also my GPA, I've gotten up a lot lately.
A challenge that I had to overcome in 6th grade was my depression, and the way I did it was by avoiding all of the bullying. And another challenge was my grades, because they were really low, and I started to focus more and remember.
Well, I've had a lot of trouble, like kind of like growing up, like it's just weird, like going through all the stuff that you go through. Like puberty's been hard for me because I just don't understand anything that I'm going through, even though I have like so many good teachers that like have taught me everything that, yeah. And I've also had a problem with my sister. We get in too many fights, and we, like she gets a lot more attention than I do often, and I get jealous, so I've come to terms with that by talking with my parents, yeah. I'm talking with my parents, even though they haven't taken too much note yet, it's getting better, so.
Well, this year I really challenged me saying mentally strong, not giving up halfway through the year, because you just think halfway through the year, oh my gosh, I have another whole half of the year. It's so heart crushing. You're I'm never gonna do this, and you somehow still do it, and you just have to think of the feeling that you get at the end when you just get out of that school and you're walking.
I appreciate all of you sharing, especially those that chose to share about their personal life.
I just wanted to see if anyone had a couple of questions. Oh, I'm seeing right here, one question is about this. I agree with you. Me too. And that way you are getting affirmation without people interjecting while you're talking. So I love that. Yes?
Can you, Dr. Silverman, can you speak to, is the questions for both of y'all by chance?
I guess I just wanted to take a quick 1 minute for the questions about the video, and then we're going to go into general questions for all of us. Yes?
Did
define Thank you for your presentations, both of you. Can you just define restorative justice? Because I'm not really sure exactly what it is. Thanks.
Okay, so restorative practices are a series of practices that are used in different contexts in order to get people's voices heard. I mean, that's the most simple way I can speak of it. Restorative justice is specifically to when there's been an event that is a problem, that it may be against the law, it may just be a push and shove, it may be an argument, but it's to resolve conflict. But the practice that you see here is just something that's being implemented on a daily basis so that people build community and get to know one another.
Thank you for your presentation. How long generally does it take for a school to get anywhere close to what you just showed us in that clip? A school I'm familiar with has just been starting, and their circles, I'm hearing from the kids and the teachers, they talk about what they're going to do next weekend, but they don't get anywhere close to what this is supposed to be about.
It depends on the principal. I'm just going to put it on the principal as a former principal. And if the principal understands it and gets it and provides the resources needed, it'll happen incredibly fast. If the principal is learning along with everyone else and is a semi-believer in it, they may or may not have made time on schedule, so it may not be happening regularly enough. One resource that OSI Baltimore put together, and these will all be on the website, is a resource manual for teachers. They're lesson plans, circle starters, so you're not having the same dry circle every day, because kids, and let the kids decide what it is they want to talk about. And I'll take one more question, and then we'll go to the whole. I'm sorry?
Hi, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Just a quick question. How would you approach students who they want to be able to share things that are that personal, but they're just not comfortable with it yet? How do you approach that, and how do you make it open for them, or would you encourage them to just speak one-on-one with someone?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. One of the things we have in our resource is an indication that those students who do not want to speak should not be encouraged, forced, or in any way bothered about speaking, because you're a participant just by being there. What happens very often when the trust is built, between the teacher and the students, is that the students will come to the teacher on their own. One of the things we also have developed is a guide so that we ask questions like, is there anyone in the circle that you would double back with? So for example, the young boy who spoke about depression, I want to know that he's okay. So on a one-on-one as teacher, I can just say, is everything good? Do you need anything? It's really common sense, but common sense ain't so common. And we should go to us. Come. Yes.
Thank you both very much.
I think, are there questions for both of us quickly? Yes. You want to take?
Sure.
Should we just sit and write?
So I'm wondering, in the truth and reconciliation process and doing this work all over the world, have you encountered this concept of territoriality of memory, the idea that if we remember one group suffering, there's a zero-sum game with other groups, and how that might get in the way, and how you have navigated that? In the United States, it's a big issue, I think.
Are we taking a few questions, or
Just a couple more, because we got.
should we take a few and then answer all, or one at a
Well,
time?
why don't you do it one at a time, because we're a little bit behind now, so
okay.
we'll keep it.
Yes, so in all contexts, everybody is competing for memory and to have a platform for their memories. Often and that's what the Truth Commission does, right? It allows other memories to surface, those that have been marginalized. And the reality is that lots of scholars have talked about this. There isn't a need for a single narrative. Like, we don't need one narrative of victory. There needs to be multiple narratives that can live alongside each other, that form some kind of consensus about what happened in the past. So what we do through our organization, the International Coalition, is we support very local memory projects, because truth commissions also can't include everybody. They have a limited amount of time, victims, resources that they have. So we also provide resources for local community groups to start their own memorialization projects so that those narratives also become part of the mainstream.
If I could just say quickly, too, sometimes it's used as a defense, and I would recommend that everyone read White Fragility, because when we talk about slavery, often what's said is, well, you guys suffered nothing compared to Native Americans, and it won't be a Native American saying that, I promise you. So it's also used as a defense, and it's not appropriate.
Thank you for your presentation today. On the RP program, is that something that was initiated externally or within the school system? And is there any? Do you have special funding for that, or is that all funded through the schools?
I wish it was all funded through the schools. It's an internal, external process. Just for full disclosure, I was in the Baltimore City School District for some 13 years. Teacher, principal, district leader, wanted to implement it from the inside, had the authority on paper to do so, could not move it. I'm at the Open Society Institute right now, have so much leverage. We are also providing funding, but the school system is kicking in too, so it's an inside-outside project.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're just going to get this other deck up, okay? I know no one's getting tired of this, right? Trouble, here we are. You can start if you want.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Lindsay, and I have the privilege of serving as one of the board members for the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, as well as serving as the co-chair for Connecting the Dots Anne Arundel County. Connecting the Dots Anne Arundel County is a coalition working in partnership with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, as well as the Equal Justice Initiative. Our coalition in Anne Arundel County was able to establish the first historical lynching marker in the state on September 7th. It was a gift from the Equal Justice Initiative, and we're very proud of this very permanent symbol starting on this path of reparations and reconciliation. Unfortunately, racism is an ever-present cloud looming over us. The 2018 Hate Bias Report, which came out a little earlier this year, found that my county, Anne Arundel County, topped the state and reported hate crimes and incidences. The report notes that in 2018, there were a total of 375 reported hate bias incidents reported by law enforcement. And the reality is that the impact of this does have a harmful effect on the Black population. But despite this, we continue to stand up. Today, I am honored to introduce Dr. Jules Harrell, who has spent many years studying this effect of racism and stress on the Black population. Dr. Harrell has been a professor of psychology at Howard University for 35 years, and he is the author of a multitude of groundbreaking works centering on the long-lasting psychological and biological effects of racism on the Black population. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Jules Harrell. Dr. Harrell.
And it's a real pleasure to be here. I don't know, when you come behind a well-crafted film and two really exciting individuals who are on the ground doing big things, you know, you almost feel like you're standing between a saturated crowd who's had so much and their lunch, you know. So I want to sort of make things move a little bit on this without rushing through. It has been 35 years at Howard for me, but the truth is this is the 40th year. at Howard, and I'd have to thank Dr. Lula Beatty, who's a member of this organization, for calling me on this and asking me if I would come up and just say a few words about the stress studies we do and what we think about stress and racism and health and those kinds of things. And I met her when I first got to Howard. She was a graduate student then. And I said, if all the graduate students are like this, I'm going to go back to graduate school and retool, because she's a brilliant person. And of course, Will Schwartz has helped me get this thing together, and we've been going back and forth on email. So I thank everyone for just the opportunity to speak to a group of this type who are dealing with some really important things. Now, the fact of the matter is that I could say what the previous two speakers said, I agree with, and then I could sit down. In fact, what you're going to find out toward the end of this thing is that we're talking about memory as a major issue and correcting memory, and we're talking about restoration as a major issue, and we end up in the same spot. We just sort of started from a little bit different points of view. So what I'll do is tell you that it's going to be 5 parts, and when we get to number 5, you know it's getting to the end. So, and we'll try to move through these as quickly as possible, leaving some time for questions at the end. The first thing I want to talk about just is this idea of lynching and its siblings and its offspring. And by that, we're talking about that sometimes words don't fail. Sometimes words are helpful. And what we're talking about, this notion of lynching and state-sanctioned killing of black people, that basically I'm reducing those to terror, that they're sending a message. That body was left out in front of that courthouse for a reason. And it was a signal to people, and it was a political signal to people about how they should agitate for their own liberation. And of course, slavery, lynching, and premature death among the oppressed, these are prime examples of what we call racism's bitter fruit. Again, this is something we cannot underscore enough, that the common denominator is always found that the oppressed's lives will be truncated, shortened, cut off by the fact that they live in an oppressive society. This is an example of American terrorism, but it's taken from the book, 12 Years a Slave. All right. Now, remember the film some years ago that came out, and the filmmaker said they tried to be really true to the text of that book, and that's a fascinating book to read, and even independent of a very interesting film about this. This is, of course, the reuniting of Solomon Northup with his family when his 12 years of being enslaved were over, and but it's this phrase from that book that haunted me the most, because he describes things to you like things that were being spoken about today. The horror of seeing a woman known then as Patsy, I'll call her Miss Patsy, who he said he had never seen anyone that regal and that strong. This is Lupita Nyong'o's character in the actual film. And to see her broken down by the end of his 12 years simply crushed him. But then he says this at the end. He says that this is no fiction, no exaggeration. If I failed in anything, it's in presenting the reader too prominently the bright side of this picture. All right, and that phrase haunted me and still haunts me to this day. What is it that he actually could not put into words? And of course, another individual that we all know very well has had a major impact on us, and this, of course, Brian Stevenson's work, and his phrase that you hear a lot now. This has become part of our language system. Brian Stevenson talking about if we've got the kind of criminal justice system where, in fact, you're better off if you're rich and guilty than you are if you're poor and innocent. All right? These are telling us what is really the offspring of a period of lynching, what is going on now. This is the reality that we're looking at. And of course, we still today have execution without trial in some cases. Execution without trial in some cases. Execution without trial in some cases. All right? And so the questions that we raise on this kind of thing is, what is the impact of this? Continued reality. What was the impact of lynching then? What is the impact of not knowing about lynching now? What is the impact of continued horror and terror of this kind? All right? always there is resistance, and we have to remember that. There was resistance then, there's resistance now. We do not want to leave that out, because we leave out a very important part of our history if we don't recognize that, yes, there was resistance to all of the kinds of things that that I've just put up here. All right. Part 2, central definitions, and these will go quickly. This is the what do you say, the classroom side of me. We got to know what we're talking about and how we're defining things. And if we don't agree with definitions, and we know that sometimes our discussions or our disagreements are really just around the fact that we don't have the terms, set up right in our heads. So this is sort of my issue that I think is important for us to describe, or at least to define in some ways. Racism, a lot of definitions, really good ones out there now. We've gone long past the idea of equating racism and saying it's the same thing as prejudice or discrimination. It's much bigger than that. I like James Jones's, he's a social psychologist who came up with this in a book called Prejudice and Racism. I like it. Exercise of power against a racial group defined as inferior by individuals and institutions. There's more to that definition, but I figured that was enough, that the power dynamic and the institutional dynamic is clear in this one. The second one I like, this notion is, what do we mean by violence? All right, this is a little trickier, because violence is more than just the physical, attack on an individual. Violence can be what? Any process, relationship, or condition by which a group violates the physical, social, psychological integrity of another. So a marriage can be very violent even though no one gets hit, all right, by structure. All right, and I think that this is important for us to keep that particular definition in mind, at least for you to know that's how I'm thinking about these terms when I throw them around and what we're talking about here. Trauma, this is the long one. You can get this on the website. This is SAMHSA. This is the Substance Abuse Administration's notion of trauma. What you'll get here is a series of events that really physically or emotionally harmful, but they can be chronic or they can be acute. They can be long-term or they can be short-term. And when we talk about trauma, we're talking about things that attack our social, emotional, and spiritual well-being also. All right. And then finally, terror is the last one. And I used the word terror before. Just wanted to let you know where I'm sort of coming at it from kind of a UN perspective on this kind of thing. All right. And my final statement on this would be what? Lynching of black bodies, traumatic, racist, and violence, and an act of terror. All right. Those terms now sort of figure into the way that I'm defining this particular process. All right, so that's part 2. Part 3, all right, things we know about trauma. These are the things I would say to you after working in this area for a long time, and that you might say, well, everybody knows that. I say, yeah, but this isn't chemistry. It's hard for us to get knowledge in the social sciences, that holds up. So I'm going to say some things that I think would hold up without a whole lot of debate back and forth, and then we'll move on from there. What we call traumatic events rain down on us from multiple levels of the society. They are sometimes the cruel act of individuals, like in some cases the lynchings that we've talked about this morning, but sometimes they also relate to institutional practices and the combinations of institutional practices, where we now start talking in those terms of what we call structural violence on individuals. So it's important to recognize that it's not something that we can attack by going at voting or by going at the legal system. It's a multi-level problem that has to be attacked on multiple levels. We're pretty much sure of that now. Second thing, human systems. Multiple human systems are affected by these things. That when we talk about what happens when I hear about Sandra Bland being killed, or when I listen to an individual actually talking to her, to her partner as he bleeds out in the front seat of a car, what does that do to me? Or what does that do to us? And I'm saying we know now for a fact that it affects us on the behavioral level. I know it affects us on the cognitive and emotional level. And then, of course, it affects us on the physiological level also. Of that, we're sure, all right? So I'd say for sure, those are the... And then last thing is this thing that we want to keep in mind, is that we know, the one thing that we know in psychology, and I will stand on this forever, is that people differ one from the other. It's very hard to make a blanket prediction. Again, we're not dealing with that kind of subject matter. And so what happens is that personality sometimes channels what we do, physiological differences channel how we respond to things, but it's important to recognize that there is no, you cannot fall, you cannot be intimidated by the fact that say, well, not everybody got sick, or not everybody, no, that's not the issue. We know that everybody will not show the same reaction to these situations. So those are the things we know pretty much for sure. Part 4, wanted to give you all just a little bit of, I think, research, recent stuff that I found kind of interesting in this area. Now, one is going to be way out there, and the other is going to be, because I'm going to take you to a place that you didn't expect me to take you, all right? And that's into the animal lab, all right? And psychologists are noted for years and years and years until we came up with what we call neuroimaging, where we can look at the brain as it works. We were always picking on some animal someplace. Be it a monkey or a rat, somebody was in trouble and we came around, all right? Okay, and so I want to take you to just a little bit of something that I think is, oh, we just lost him. Let's see if we go back. Why does it do that? This must be an apple. No. Why did it do that? Let's see if we go to that. We're in trouble. Wait, hang on a second. We go to card slide. Oh, it's doing a thing. It's the circle of death here. Oh, that's the circle of death? Yeah, I'm afraid so. I bought an alternative computer. No, where are you hooked in? I don't know what to do. Where is your connection? Yeah. It's right here. Right. Okay, so is it a USB? No. Hang on. Okay, whoops. Should be there. It's close. That looks close. Here, is that, all right, no signal. Here we go. Bingo. We did have a co-pilot there, though. We did have, my wife has the computer over there, so if this happens again, we'll just, we'll get somebody to come in off the bench and we'll work it out. All right. Just a quick statement that I think that is, we need to say it and underscore it, that we always think about how our biology sort of affects our behavior. Our genes affect our behavior. What we're learning now is that, in fact, that arrow between biology and psychology, or biology and these other external events, the arrow should have 2 points on it because it works backwards. And I'll say this really quickly because I know that I lost some of my time with the thing. But we thought 20 years ago that the real issue would be the sort of marking of the human genome. We've sort of established what gene goes with what. And what we found out after that, it's not the human genome, it's the human epigenome. In other words, it's the issue of what genes are going to be expressed. And that's a function of how the environment, how other genes affect the expression of genes. So this idea of these things going back and forth is something you want to keep framed in your mind when you're thinking about the effects of lynching and the effects of these other issues. And so here's a study I want you to think about. And this is a group of rats who are taught to fear a particular odor because every time that odor is presented to them, they get a shock on their little foot. All right, and rats do not like that. Rats, their feet are important because they have a lot of their memory is place memory, and it's sort of like visual is important to them, but they have ways of the motor system, motor movement, so they're sensitive to that. The offsprings are then presented the odor that was associated with the shock and a loud noise, and then the grandchildren are presented the odor and a loud noise. All right. What happens is that when you present the offspring, the odor that the parents learn to fear and this noise, they show what we call the startle probe reaction, that they're startled by it. When you do it with the grandchildren, the same thing happens. All right. So the actual, we're not looking at the actual visual that we have of this didn't show up on this one, but it shows you that in fact the stress effects are transmitted across generations. All right, and that's something you want to keep in mind, is that we didn't know that things could be written that way transgenerationally. But people have talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome and all these kinds of issues. And what I'm saying to you is that the animal research is sort of showing us the same kind of thing. All right. All right. This is the second paper I wanted you just to be aware of, and it's something that I have a fear that if our first visual slide didn't show up, the second one may not show up either. But this is a study that came out in Lancet, which is a major British medical journal. It came out last summer. All right, and what they did is it's a complicated study, but I think what you'd want to look at on this thing is that in fact we're talking about, they sampled 100,000 African Americans in this study, and they did it across the entire United States, going at urban areas. And what they were concerned about, what they were looking at, is how often do these individuals who were employed report that they had to take a mental health day. Some days you say, I just can't face it today. You know, it happens. All right. Now I happen to have the kind of job where I've never gone to work. All right. I working at Howard University. I told people this is what I do anyway: run my mouth and try to read. You know, so I never had to work at that time. But these individuals were asked, okay, how about mental health days? And then they looked at the location of where they were, and whether or not there had been a killing of an unarmed black individual without any kind of prosecution in that area over that particular time. And so it's a really involved study, but it's a fascinating one to read, because they went in and sort of looked at the historical kinds of events surrounding when they talked to the people, and then they looked at 6 months before and 6 months after that, what was going on. All right. Oh, it did work. I'm surprised. Okay. Now, what you're looking at, this is only an academic slide I got up here, all right, so be patient with it. What you're looking at here is on the x-axis going across there are months before, where it turns gray, at that gray point, that's where the actual event occurs. You're talking about on the y-axis the number of mental health days people are reporting. All right, and so right after the gray period, you see a movement up to where I boxed it in. That's that period shortly after this killing of an unarmed black person in the particular region. All right, that's where they, in fact, are reporting increased mental health days. Now they go through and they went through all kinds of gymnastics, statistical ones and methodological ones, to try to get this effect out of there. Could it have been weather? Could it have been, all kinds of things? And they do all these into the analysis, and it still persists. All right. And the persistent thing is that, in fact, the mental health of individuals is now clearly affected by the fact that these things are going on around us. And I thought that the fact that it was, that it was published in a medical journal is a real step forward, because it means medical people are really recognizing now that these external events are impacting people's overall well-being and health. All right. The lessons from this particular part, can't remember if we're on 4 or 5, I think it's at 4. All right. The traumatic effects of lynching are passed on possibly across generations. All right, there may be intergenerational effects of these things, and that's what we're beginning to study now. And then mental health, of course, impacted. That's what these two studies, which I think are kind of interesting studies, kind of tell us. Finally, on repair, I wanted to just leave where you all took us. And again, I'd love to have my thunder stolen by individuals that are out there doing things and making the world better. So this is an individual who we follow very, very closely in the field of psychology, even though he was a psychiatrist by training. And I always tell people that this individual is similar to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in the sense that he never saw his 40th birthday. All right. None of those three individuals ever saw it. But the writings that Frantz Fanon did as a psychiatrist affect us even today. All right, affect us today. That he says that, look, if we've got a problem here, it exists on 2 levels. All right, and if we're going to fix it, he says that there's an economic problem, and he was talking about then colonialism in a lot of his work. But he says that there's a internalization problem. And his point that the two speakers before me said is that, you know, you've got to work on both levels. You've got to work on both levels in order to have any kind of an effect. Waging war on one level and assuming that's going to affect the other, he calls that simply folly. It's not going to work. I like this because, and I should always acknowledge that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a Baltimore person, although he did study at Howard, but that's we'll leave that alone, right? But he voices in this novel, the novel that my wife just read to me because she reads beautifully, and I don't, but she read this novel. He through his Harriet Tubman character in that novel, he says, you know, it really comes down, or Harriet Tubman is saying, it really comes down to memory, all right? Memory is the chariot, the memory is the way, memory is the bridge from the curse of slavery to the boon of freedom, all right? And somehow or another, this process of making certain things do not stay buried, very, very important to the overall healing and restoration of people. That these are my, in terms of repair, that I think memories, even the unconscious ones, they impact our health. Those the second generation rats have no conscious recollection of why it is that they show these startled reactions, but they do. There are things that go on in our systems, probably passed on unconsciously, that affect our health that we just simply we simply are not aware of, but they will affect our well-being. I think we must explore both the fabric of the present, the kind of society we're in now. We've got to take a serious look at it. Why certain things come back again and again. Why every time the television comes on, you hope you don't see some tragedy of a young black life being cut short because of some rash decision. That we have to understand the present as well as the past. That memory must be honored and explored as part of this repair process. And of course, I didn't know anyone else would use the R word, but I was glad to hear that there's a very interesting book called Repair that just came out. Frankel is the author, called Repair, that talks about the fact that we're now getting to the point where people in my generation, what we call boomers, all right, people in this generation of Americans will pass down more wealth to the next generation than anyone has ever conceived of in the world. And she's talking about billions and billions, 40, 50 billions of dollars are going to be passed on primarily through the inheritance of property. Black folks have been left out of that equation largely. All right, so we're about to see a transfer of wealth that's unprecedented, all right, that are just simply going to compound some of the problems that we're seeing out here. And it's going to be done with the idea of, well, okay, we've changed some laws and everything is fine. Reparations is something we have to look at seriously because gaps will get wider and wider and wider if we don't. And so I think for centuries of terror, trauma, and racist conditions, we have to deal with a sort of a proactive repair process. All right, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. You know, there's one thing that I just wanted to add. You're talking about the importance of memory and not losing the memory. And I apologize to people who have heard me tell this story before, but it's relevant right now. And that is that, it never ceases to amaze me that the Greeks who we extol for rationality and philosophy and beauty and those Greek things, they did not have a word for truth, which is stunning. But the word that they did use is alethe, which means not forgotten, literally. So there you go. So listen.
Really quick. Yeah. There is a case that you all will hear about. Psychologists always talk about a case of an individual. They called him H.M. His real name was Henry Mollison. And somebody, because he had severe seizures, they took out part of what's called his hippocampus in his brain and a little bit of the temporal lobes. And Henry Mollison could no longer make new memories. So he lived maybe 30 or 40 years, unable to remember, the next day, what happened to him the previous day. You've seen some movies on this kind of thing. One of the things that's not talked about with Henry Mollison is that it really impacted his use of his imagination also. And so I think that when we cut out memory, we might be making a frontal assault on our imaginations. And it's innovation and imagination that allows us to sort of move forward.
makes us human. It makes us human. Thank you so much. So, everyone, we've reached halftime here. I want to take a kind of a quick break because we're a little bit behind, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for our people who are going to be part of our coalition group later on. I would ask one favor. I think I lost a file folder. If anyone sees a manila folder, you'll know it's mine because it's got some blank checks in it. So I would take it. Just keep one of the checks and give me the rest back, and be all right. Thank you very much. 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excellent. My name is Tony Cohen. I am a board member of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and a board member of the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project. Can I hear it from my Montgomery County peeps in the house? Yes. Represent, represent. All right. So I would like to introduce.
The
let's do this
video.
first. Yeah. You're going to get me one way or another. Here we go. While much is known about George Peck's death, little is known about his life. He was born into slavery in 1858, most likely here in Montgomery County. As a young man, he worked as a farm laborer in Poolsville and later in nearby Bellsville. It was there, on the morning of January 10, 1880, that George Peck was accused of a crime, the alleged assault of a white girl. George Peck was dragged through the streets with a rope around his neck to a makeshift gallows, the outstretched arm of a locust tree in a field across from the Presbyterian Church was chosen by the mob as the spot at which to lynch Mr. Peck. There, in night shadows, without judge or justice, George Peck was hoisted from the ground to his death. In the end, no one was held accountable for the injustice perpetrated on Mr. Peck. So today, we convene as a united community to remember and to take stock of that solemn event by committing ourselves to racial unity, social justice, and the ongoing quest for truth and reconciliation.
Thank you, Jay. Tony, it's all you.
Thank you again to Jay Mallon for that beautiful, emotive piece. Again, I'm Anthony Cohen, and I am introducing our next speaker. Dr. Where did my notes go? Dr. David Fakunle is a lifetime member of the Great Blacks in Wax Museum here in Baltimore. If you've never been, you got to go. It is amazing. One of the wonders of the Baltimore world and beyond. Dr. Fakunle is also known as the Mercenary of Change. He is going to take the stage now, and thank you very much, sir.
No problem. I'm good. I got my own. How y'all doing? I'm all right. This has been a wonderful, wonderful event. I hope y'all can indulge me for a little bit. Close your eyes. I promise nothing's gonna happen to you. I want to take you to a forest. There's a slight breeze in the air. Now we're by a highway, but it's almost as if the cars know not to drive at this moment. You can hear the rustling of the trees, the crunching of leaves beneath your feet. There's a voice speaking, calling out the names of ancestors. There's another voice singing, strong, firm, but also almost like a sense of reverence. I just want you to kind of place yourself in that space, whatever that looks like to you. there's an aura that you feel this entire time. You can't even really explain it, but you know that something is there with you in that moment. Okay, open your eyes. That was literally me last week with my mother and with one of my cultural mamas in Selma, Alabama. We had just crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Birmingham back into Selma. And there was a gentleman by the name of Columbus who was on the on the Birmingham side, the Montgomery side. And talking to he's just keeping watch and just looking over the memorial to Bloody Sunday, saying his uncle was a part of it. And then he directed us to the forest right by the Alabama River, right under the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And there was a memorial commemorating the fact that lynchings occurred in that forest. And so me, my mother, and my mama Cheryl, we walked into that forest and we felt it. We felt the spirits that was still there in that forest. Now, I try my best to be in touch with the universe as much as I can help it, but I don't claim to be the best, but I felt it that day. That was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. That really made my trip to Montgomery, Alabama worth it. So as the interim chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that brought it home as to why what we're doing is so important. This is the first time in the history of this country, the United States of America, that we have a public body voted unanimously by a state legislature, the Maryland State Legislature, due to the courageous efforts of Delegate Joseline Pena-Melnick. Yeah, clap it up, clap it up. To have this body that is specifically dedicated to chronicling and telling the story of racial terror lynchings in the state of Maryland. And I'll tell you the truth. I became the interim chair simply because I was the only one to raise my hand. I'm gonna be honest with you. But after the fact, in retrospect, especially as we went on, it really got to me that the typical victim of racial terror lynchings was someone that looked like me. And yet I'm the one now in charge of telling their story, guiding the story that we're gonna tell about those victims. So there's something, it's almost like this was meant to be, you know? And I take that with a lot of reverence and responsibility. I became aware of lynchings when I was a teenager due to the National Gray Blacks and Wax Museum. The lynching exhibit opened up in like 2001. And I went down there because that's my home. Like, I've been a part of the museum since birth, before birth. And once I got past, obviously, the visceral horror of what the exhibit was trying to show, I was able to really begin to process all the systems that led to those moments, those very visceral moments of racial terror. Because we realize that's just one example of the terror that is experienced in this country. The most visceral. You can't not see it. But I think one of the goals of this commission is not just to memorialize and to elevate the story of the victims of racial terror lynchings in the state, but to really begin to hold accountable the systems that allow those lynchings to, because mind you, most of these happen in where? Courthouses. Representations of our government allowed this to happen simply because of the color of my skin. It's powerful, yo. It's very, very powerful. And we realize as fellow commissioners, and all of us, because this is, don't just focus on the 18 commissioners that are a part of this. This is our commission. We all are tasked to tell this story. We are all tasked to hold accountable the systems that allowed this to happen, to elevate the stories of the victims. So I did go to the Memorial for Peace and Justice as well. That was powerful too. It was overwhelming. All the names, even all the unknowns that were in that space. And then when I came to the end, I saw the duplicates of those monuments. So I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble, but I'm telling you now, Will, fellow commissioners, one of our recommendations is that those duplicates are coming to Maryland. They're coming to Maryland. They're coming to Maryland. So that when people come back to Montgomery, Alabama, and see those duplicates, they will see that Maryland's is gone. We recognize our culpability, this state's culpability, in the racial terror lynchings that happened here. We want to set an example for the rest of this country. Sure, it starts with the lynchings, but this is going to be a referendum on racism in this country. We got to start somewhere. We're going to start with us. So it's a heavy task. It's a heavy task. We're not getting paid for this. So this is all out of the goodness of our heart, but all out of the responsibility to our people and to the true history of this country. If this country is going to tout its ideology the way that it does, the first step we got to take is to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help us God. You know what I'm saying? So what we're doing right now is just getting the foundation of the commission set so that when we go into 2020, we can start the substantive work. So my fellow commissioners, raise your hands. I know we all over the place. Thank y'all. I want to thank y'all now. I want to thank y'all now for the incredible work that we've been doing. To all the activists, all those that are leading the charges in their counties to, again, elevate the story of lynchings, we thank you. We need you. We can't do this alone, nor do we want to do this alone. This is meant to be collective. This is meant to be transparent. This is meant to honor the power that you all are bringing to telling this story. So many of the things that Dr. Naidu Silverman talked about, we're going to learn from that. We want to learn from what has worked and what hasn't worked. But we're also going to push, really, really push. There is nothing off the table for us as a commission. I appreciate Delegate Pena-Melnick for writing that into the law. Gives us a lot of leeway. A lot of leeway. And I'm going to tell you now, I'm an unabashed opportunist. We're going to take some chances. But we're going to make sure we do this right. We're going to make sure all our ducks in a row, because the more that this gets out, oh yeah, there's definitely going to be some pushback. Bring it. Bring it. This is long overdue. I think we all know that. So I'm preaching to the choir here, so I ain't got to sell y'all on this. But all I'll say is this. Again, thank you. This didn't start with us. This has been happening for generations. And we know that there are so many stories out there, not just the stories of the victims and their families, but even the perpetrators, the spectators. I couldn't imagine being a little kid, seeing this, having no idea what's going on, and the trauma that was left with me after seeing something like that. So there's plenty of victims in these circumstances, and we need to honor all of that. We need to allow the space to heal on all sides. We need to allow the space for understanding on all sides. Because if you don't think people were brainwashed so that they could convince themselves that what they were doing was fine because these people aren't even human, what do you call it? What do you call that? So we need to honor that too and allow them time to heal and the space to heal and to understand and to work to rectify the situation. Because I believe that all of us as human beings want the same thing. We want love. We want peace. We want understanding. We want justice. We want to be seen. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be heard. We want to be felt. So when we say, you feel me? We truly mean that. Do you feel me? So that is the aim of this commission. And the work is just beginning. We welcome your insight. We welcome your wisdom. We welcome your efforts, your resources. Again, we need you. And we thank you. And you're going to respect our existence, or you're going to expect our resistance. Respect our existence, I'm sorry. So that's why I wore this shirt. I've never worn this shirt until today. I'm not the biggest fan of like long sleeve shirts. Like, I'm really not, but I'm going to stand up so y'all can see it. This is what we want ultimately. Respect our existence, or expect our resistance. Oh, well, you know what? I'm feeling good right now. All right, can we repeat after me? Respect our existence, or expect our resistance. Let's say it one more time. Respect my existence, or expect my resistance. One more time, as a group, as a collective. Come on now. Here we go. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Respect my existence or expect my resistance. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good luck following that.
I'm going to try to follow that the best I can. I'm indeed thankful, though, that Brother David is heading this commission. We need passionate people behind the helm of this commission to see it to where it needs to go. My name is Charles Chavis. I am assistant professor of history and conflict resolution at George Mason University, but I come by way of Morgan State University as well, where I received my PhD in 2018, and worked closely with several individuals named, including Dr. Simone Barrett, as well as the individual whom I'm going to introduce. So I'm not going to stand between you all and lunch anymore. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So for over 30 years, Pace McConkey has served as a civil rights attorney advocating for civil rights at all levels of the educational system. Over the years, Mr. McConkey has served in a number of prominent positions, serving as a staff member to the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Education and Labor Committee. He also served as Assistant General Counsel for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is where he received the prestigious honor as being named the NAACP Attorney of the Year at the National Convention in 1994. Shortly thereafter, 1998, he became Assistant Attorney General and Principal Counsel to the Maryland Higher Education Commission. Since 2010, he has served as the Director of the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights and Education, established at Morgan State University, where he continues to fight for racial equity in education. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Pace McConkey.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. I'd like to invite Victor Good to please come and take a seat up here with me. Victor Good is my longtime friend and colleague, primarily working together with the NAACP in civil rights litigation involving public schools. Victor is Assistant General Counsel to the NAACP and has been for many, many years, and has served also as Interim Director of Education for the National NAACP, all out of their national office here in Baltimore. Victor, thanks for joining us. You want to take a seat? Thank you. The state of Maryland continues to maintain and perpetuate a separate and unequal system of higher education that is segregated by race and which discriminates against the students that attend the state's 4 historically black institutions in violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Thus, I have just quoted Judge Catherine C. Blake, Federal District Judge in Maryland, in her recent ruling in the case of Coalition for Equity and Excellence in Maryland Higher Education versus the Maryland Higher Education Commission et al., pending litigation in federal courts. I'll repeat one more time. The state of Maryland continues to maintain and perpetuate a separate and unequal system of higher education that is segregated by race and which discriminates against the students who attend the state's 4 historically black institutions in violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Did all of you know that? That is the current status of higher education in the great state of Maryland. A pending case now before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit. So, now that I have your attention, I want to just step back for a few minutes so that we can establish how we got to this point. Most importantly, linking the foundational racism, white supremacy, and white privilege of slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow segregation to the contemporary policies and practices that remain in place and which, either by intent or designated purpose or by discriminatory impact or effect, violate the constitutional and civil rights of African American and other minority students, and remove them effectively from mainstream educational opportunities otherwise available to their white counterparts. That's what Victor and I want to talk about today. I'm going to continue for a few minutes with respect to higher education, and Victor will lead us in a discussion with respect to elementary and secondary education. We follow the presentations that have already been given, including Dr. Harrell's definition of racism, which we know is much more than just a, what I call, repugnantly false sense of superiority of one person or a group of persons over another person or group of persons solely because of race. That is the ideology of racism. But racism is not complete as an ideology because it is coupled with actions. In other words, policies and practices that were put in place primarily to establish a social structure and a power structure, primarily to maintain and perpetuate the privilege of the race that claims to be superior. In this case, white privilege and white supremacy. So the blatant racism that we sometimes see is easy to identify and for most people, not all, easy to condemn. So when white supremacists carry tiki torches and march in Charlottesville and shout white supremacist slogans, most people might be able to condemn that as blatant racism. Or when a young man walks into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, to a Bible study class and opens fire and kills all of those present, and then openly declares that he had hoped to cause a race war, that is blatant racism. That's easy to see and easy to condemn. But it is the structural, institutional, and systemic racism that we really need to address. And it manifests itself in every facet of our society, including education, business, employment, labor, the economy, housing, voting, and political empowerment, the criminal justice system, policing, law enforcement, environmental justice, public accommodations, religion. Virtually no institution escapes it. And literally, it is this type of systemic structural racism that I believe Charles Hamilton Houston, that great dean of the law school at Howard and first general counsel at the NAACP and the architect of the legal campaign to dismantle the pillars of racial segregation in this country, when he said that lawyers are either social engineers or they are parasites on society, okay? Because he knew that what we were trying to dismantle was structural, systemic, institutional racism. And when he and his cadre of lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, started to attack the pillars of segregation, which culminated in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, they actually started with a series of cases in higher education. Thurgood Marshall, who was at one point denied even the opportunity to submit an application to attend the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland Law School, later, as a lawyer, was able to bring a case in 1936 to admit Donald P. Murray as the first African American to the University of Maryland School of Law. In other cases, like Missouri ex rel. Gaines v. Canada, Sweat v. Painter, McLaren v. Oklahoma, a series of precedents were set in higher education by identifying and challenging and attacking higher education policies and practices that were discriminatory and segregative. And that resulted in the ultimate conclusion of Brown that separate was inherently unequal, and that education, where the state undertakes to provide it to anyone, is a right that must be made available to all on equal terms. Now, throughout the South, including Maryland, despite further mandates that this ruling be implemented with all deliberate speed, and that the eradication of vestiges of segregation be fulfilled root and branch, there was considerable recalcitrance and resistance. And an ultimate ruling of the courts held that if there is any continuing policy or practice in our schools, including colleges, that would foster discrimination on the basis of race or perpetuate the conditions indicative of the former segregated system, then they must be addressed and eliminated. So Brown was 1954. In 1964, the Congress had to pass the Civil Rights Act, including Title VI, to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in any program that receives federal funding, like our schools, and the millions of dollars that colleges and universities in Maryland receive from the federal government. In 1968, the Adams v. Richardson cases were filed seeking federal order compelling the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, to perform its responsibilities and enforce compliance with Title VI upon the states with the jury-segregated systems of higher education. That was in 68. In 1969, I will call OCR, came to Maryland and said, you are one of those states, and you are not in compliance with federal law, and actually threatened to remove federal funds from Maryland's system of higher education. In response, Maryland filed a lawsuit to seek an injunction against the federal government from prohibiting or from eliminating federal resources to our system of higher education. That resulted in a rather lengthy lawsuit, and it wasn't until 1980 and 1985 that Maryland agreed to its first desegregation plan that was acceptable to the federal government. A two-part segregation plan: the continued integration of Maryland's traditionally white institutions through a portfolio of enrollment goals, recruitment measures, retention efforts, and affirmative action plans. And two, the enhancement of Maryland's historically black institutions to ensure that they are comparable to and competitive with the TWIs with respect to operating budget, capital facilities, and new academic programs. In 2006, following two more agreements that the state of Maryland entered into with the Office for Civil Rights, a lawsuit was filed against the state of Maryland by a coalition of students, alumni, faculty, and supporters of the four historically black institutions in Maryland, claiming that the state of Maryland had failed to dismantle its de jure system of segregation, and claiming that it had not only failed to do it, but that it continued to maintain and perpetuate policies and practices that would keep that segregated and discriminatory system in place. I've already recited to you the holding of the court in 2013, finding that to be so. In a nutshell, the court, despite evidence that was presented with respect to policies and practices for funding of these schools, budgetary practices, the allocation of missions to these institutions, what the court found was that the way the state of Maryland approves and assigns academic programs to its various campuses across the state, and the way in which it unnecessarily duplicates the programs at the historically black colleges at the geographically proximate, traditionally white institutions, was part and parcel of the original segregated system. In fact, it was the means by which Maryland established segregated institutions of higher education. It created institutions with programs for black students and institutions and programs for white students, and did not allow the races to mix. And maintained those policies for decades and decades before Brown. And what the court recently held is that it maintained those policies and practices for decades after Brown. And they remain in place today in violation of the rights of students who go to the HBIs. And the court said a remedy is required. And it set forth in its ruling a framework for that remedy to fix the constitutional violation and problem. One, it must cease and desist from its practice of unnecessary program duplication. Two, it must enhance the existing programs at the historically black institutions to make them viable well into the future. Third, there must be an influx of new, high-demand programs at the historically black institutions that will remain unique to the historically black institutions, not duplicated elsewhere. Four, with respect to these new high-demand programs, the state must establish academic niches or areas of excellence for each of the 4 HBIs so that they are identifiable by their academic programs and their missions. The court also in its framework said that there must be or may need to be some transfer of programs from the traditionally white programs, schools, back to the historically black institutions. It then said that there may need to be some collaboration among these institutions, all for the purpose of enhancing the educational opportunity of African Americans who choose to attend these institutions, consistent with the historical missions of the institutions, and also to make these institutions comparable to and competitive with their traditionally white counterparts so that they might be attractive to students of all races. The state of Maryland appealed that liability order. It also followed, that trial was followed by a lengthy remedial trial where the court issued a remedial order basically to do everything I just recited to you, with one addition, that there would be a court-appointed special master, and I apologize for the court for the use of that phrase, in a legacy of slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow case, but that's a judicial term, right, Judge Bell? So a special master would then work with the judge and the parties to identify what those academic niches or areas of excellence will be for the 4 HBIs and what exactly those programs will be implemented at the HBIs, and then cost it out, and the court would order the implementation of the programs at whatever it may cost. You may have read that there have been negotiations going back and forth. Suffice it to say that no settlement has been reached, and that case now is pending before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit, having been argued last December, almost a year ago. So I just wanted to use that as an example of what the court found to be structural, systemic, institutionalized racism in higher education in Maryland by virtue of policies and practices that were clearly a part of the segregated system and which remain in place today and must be remedied. With that, I would like Victor to identify some policies and practices in elementary and secondary schools. Oh, okay.
All right. Can I advance with this?
You can if you want.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I'll just stand over here if you're using it.
How do you get the thing on?
Good?
Yeah, cool. All right. Good morning. I thank PACE for the invitation, and I bring you greetings from the National Office of the NAACP. I can't help but following up on Pace's comment about the special master. I can't resist. So last October, and this is a school conditions case. Last October, we got this anonymous letter from some folks in a little town in Louisiana called Jonesville. Can y'all hear me? Jonesville, Louisiana. And they were complaining about not enough books, fungus and mold in the books, kids having to share books because there weren't enough, not enough certified teachers it was in the girls' bathroom, the stalls on the doors on the stalls, they were all broken and there was just no privacy. Have y'all heard of the wrong side of the tracks? Well, this was the wrong side of the tracks. And believe it or not, this school district was under a school deseg case, a case being prosecuted by the Department of Justice against the school district. And yet you had these problems. Kids were even protesting, boycotting the classes because of these terrible conditions. But in response to this request for help, we got permission from the court to file an amicus brief or friend of the court brief. And in that brief, we asked the court to appoint a special master to help the parties do what the court had already ordered the parties to do. So I'll stop there. One of the problems, in response to the question, did it work? One of the problems that we're seeing in this case, which is an old problem, is resistance. Resistance to this effort to desegregate. Now, probably the classic cases of resistance, one of the Brown cases was from South Carolina, and there was a reverend who did most of the organizing in that case. He was a principal and a preacher. Would you believe they burned down his church? They fired him. They fired his wife and some relatives who were teaching at the school. Night riders shot into his house. He called the police. They didn't come, and he called them back, still waiting for them to come. They didn't come, and then they burned his house down. And then, when they fired into his house, he returned fire. And they charged him with attempted murder or something like that, so he had to flee. Now that's resistance. That's resistance. And then in another one of the Brown cases from Virginia, when the court finally issued the order, this was Prince Edwards County, Virginia. Would you believe they closed the school? I don't mean just they closed it over Christmas. I don't mean they just closed it for, the semester. They closed it for 5 years. Now that's resistance. Now, getting back to this little Jonesville, Louisiana case, we had to go to court. Now, we're not a party. We, the NACP, the Louisiana NACP, we're not a party in this case, but we're trying to respond to this anonymous letter. And so the court gives us the right to file a brief, and we asked the court, well, can we also attend this site visit that DOJ and the school district were going to have at the school? So we got approval for that on this Friday evening. Now ask me when we found out the schedule for this site visit. 45 minutes before the site visit. And I won't even tell you how long it took us to get the mold reports that you're supposed to get under the public records law, even in Louisiana. We got those that Friday night too. So it's not working too well. But I will say on the good side, the court denied our request to appoint a special master, but the court put both parties on a really short leash, requiring them to report every couple of weeks on their progress, report to the court, and setting a hearing on it. So that's progress. That's progress, but resistance. Now, I was going to talk about the context of race in public schools, but after hearing watching the documentary about, remember Howard Cooper, the Howard Cooper documentary? One sentence: they didn't want to do a lynching on a Sunday. That might be a metaphor for the contradictions in the promise of the 14th Amendment within the ed context. That flag up there in the picture, that's a flag that flew on our New York office in the early 1900s in the midst of all the lynchings. So here's some examples of public school issues before Brown. Catonsville in the 30s had a black elementary school, but Baltimore County refused education to black students past the 6th grade and required black students seeking additional education to pass an elementary school exit exam. Talk about a high-stakes exam. If the students passed, the county would pay for their education. Margaret Williams failed the exam twice. Her parents demanded that the county either create a high school for black students or admit them to the county schools. Thurgood Marshall represented the Williams and Scott in their unsuccessful suit, but 2 years later, the county arranged for high school curriculum to be taught at 3 black elementary schools, essentially creating black high schools. Now, I don't know about the quality of the teachers that they brought to this high school curriculum in elementary school. I don't know about the funding that they provided for this high school curriculum in elementary schools, but that was something. Mills versus Board of Education of Anne Arundel County. So this case challenged, a Maryland statute that set lower minimum salaries for teachers at colored schools than for teachers at all-white schools. In 1939, the district court ordered Maryland to cease salary discrimination based on race. Another example, Kerr versus Enoch Pratt Free Public Library of Baltimore City. It was a federal challenge to be admitted for Ms. Kerr to be admitted to its instructional class for prospective librarians. The court said the denial based solely on her race was unconstitutional state action, because Pratt Library was completely owned and controlled by the state. Now, there were some other cases during this period where kids sought, seemed like technical, maybe post-high school education, but the education providers were private companies. And those cases were not so successful. Also, in '42, the Baltimore blacks demanded that the school board provide black representation. You may not be surprised that segregation is expanding in almost all regions of the country. Little has been done for a generation. Maryland, as Pace noted, was one of the 17 states that had de jure, or by law, segregation, had an intense history of school segregation. Following Brown, school districts across the state employed various methods to desegregate. Mandatory busing in Prince George's County, magnet schools in Montgomery County, and a freedom of choice plan in Baltimore. Despite some progress after plans that had the explicit goals of decreasing segregation ended, many of the schools in Maryland again reached high levels of segregation. But it's not just segregation. A recent General Accounting Office report showed that the share of K through 12 schools with students who are poor and mostly black and or Latino is growing. The GAO also found that compared to other schools, these schools offer disproportionately fewer math, science, and college prep courses, and they had higher rates of students who were held back in the 9th grade, suspended, or expelled. So the quality of the schools was different as well. We must also work to ensure that students in segregated classes and schools get what they need for success. After Brown, these are the kind of issues that the courts looked at to determine, or looked at and look at, where those cases are still open, to determine whether to find that the districts are unitary, or to put it in layman's language, the districts have, to the extent practicable, complied with the court's orders to desegregate. They look at student assignment, faculty and staff assignment, transportation, extracurricular activities, and facilities. Additional factors, such as student discipline, have sometimes been considered by courts to determine whether the districts have remaining vestiges of discrimination. Also, as Pace talked about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So in 54 was Brown, 55 was Brown 2, where the court said, okay, a year ago we said separate but equal is out. It's not constitutional. And then in 55, the court said, you got to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And then in 64, Congress passed a bunch of Civil Rights Acts, but one of them was Title VI, which, as Pace said, if an entity, a school system, but not just school systems, receives federal financial assistance, it may not discriminate based on race or national origin. And so LBJ believed in enforcement, and again, as Pace noted, y'all remember HEW? Health, Education, and Welfare. Well, that's the predecessor to the U.S. Department of Education and HHS, Health and Human Services. So, but HEW was Health, Education, and Welfare. So it was a different organization, but it was designed to deal with education and some non-education issues. And then there was, with a different administration, HEW was out, Ed was in, HHS was in. So LBJ believed in enforcing the anti-segregation, anti-discrimination laws in Title VI. And HEW played a major role in that. So as a practical matter, you had these discrimination challenges going on both in the courts and in the administrative agency, the Federal Administrative Agency. But as a practical matter, litigation is expensive. Now, the last time I told a group that litigation was expensive, I got a complaint filed against me. This was in Virginia, and I was accused of pole-mouthing the NAACP because I was simply explaining, we were talking about redistricting, not education, but I was explaining the cost of a redistricting lawsuit. You know, I felt I had an obligation. So when Dr. Harrell was talking about that memory, I felt I needed to tell you this, but I have that memory going. I hope nobody files a complaint against me for, anyway. Speaking of the address, it's 4805 Mount Hope Drive, but we are moving, and I'm not going to tell you the new one. One of our new offices is in Baltimore, downtown Baltimore, but I'm not going to that one. I'm going to the one in D.C., and I'm not going to tell you where that one is. It will be in the NEA building, not the National Endowment for the Arts building, because that may not be around very much longer, but the National Education Agency building. 16th Street. Oh, 16th Street? Okay, yeah. So the work, doing the litigation on these cases in the courts and in the Federal Administrative Agency, you had two tactical approaches, but of course, filing the administrative complaints is a lot more efficient. It's a lot cheaper. But it really, really works when you have a president who believes in civil rights, but when you have a president who's an anti-civil rights proponent, it doesn't work quite as well. And so after LBJ was gone, Nixon came on, and Nixon was anti-civil rights. And so there, began to have problems with that. Problems that actually have been reflected since then when you've had presidents that were less than rah-rah civil rights. So today, we are in a states' rights environment. We continue to demand federal enforcement of our civil rights. We have to. But at the same time, because of this states' rights environment, we have to find local and state vehicles, mechanisms, approaches to get what we need. So these are what I call post-Brown school priorities. The previous slide. Okay, all right. So the previous slide talked about what the courts look at. These are like policy provisions, policy priorities that we see in our schools today, whether we're talking about a court case or whether we're talking about kids who need help. And, you know, they range from supporting public education, opposing privatization with public money, targeted adequate funding, universal high-quality pre-K, effective teaching in every classroom, fair discipline, more time for more learning, diversity, parent community engagement. And then on the right side, these are priorities under the Every Student Succeeds Act, the law that replaced No Child Left Behind. I mean, I suspect that most of you probably know one of these is timely support for struggling students. It sounds so good, but how many of you know struggling kids who, they can't wait for the state's timetables to kick in? They need help yesterday, otherwise we're going to lose them. And so that's one of the challenges, is how to get these kids the help they need, like right now. And it's not impossible, but it's more than a notion, because there are lots of these kids. 1 minute? 1 minute. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the importance of literacy. Literacy wasn't listed as one of those priorities, but literacy or illiteracy is at the bedrock of many of our problems. If you just look at the fourth grade reading scores for NAEP 2019 for Maryland, 22% of Black and 22% of Latina students in Maryland who took it scored at or above proficient. That's abysmal. And so one of the practical questions for your school systems and for state education officials, indeed for political officials, is, so what is your literacy program? Actually, there's a state of Maryland literacy program. But like someone said in the past, having a program is one thing, how it gets implemented is a whole another thing. I'm down to about 15 seconds. And so I didn't get to talk about the silos, and, you know, education advocates tend to talk about education. And so as an example of that, like, folks hate closing Black schools, at least my NAACP affiliates. They hate it when school systems decide they're going to close black schools. But very often, the education folks may not be looking at the bigger pictures because they're focused on the schools. And some of these school closings, the school closings are only part of a bigger redevelopment picture plan where they're either displacing Blacks or they're keeping Blacks from being able to move into redeveloped developments. And so the silo thing is, it's important for the education folks and the housing and economic development folks to kind of work together so that we can get the big picture as well as the little picture. And my time is up. Thank you so much.
So Will's going to come and close. I just think that it's quite evident that the legacy of slavery, the legacy of lynching, and Jim Crow continue to manifest themselves in very significant and serious ways right now, today, in our systems of elementary, secondary, and higher education. And while we look at lynching as the most extreme example of how white supremacists remove African Americans from society. We cannot dismiss any of these policies and practices that remain in place right now as attempts to at least remove African American and minorities from mainstream opportunities in society, to say nothing of those who continue to lose their lives. And so we appreciate having this discussion with you today.
Thank you, Pace. Thank you, everyone. Before class is dismissed, I did want to mention, for the people who are going to the lunch with the commissioners and the county coalition leaders, David Fakunle and Charles Chavis will lead you across to where that is taking place. They'll be out in the lobby. Please meet them there. Everyone else, thank you so much. I hope it was a worthwhile day for you. I mean, one thing that I'm going to carry from this is that, truth and reconciliation is more than digging soil and putting up signs, right? It's about committing acts of social justice, and I know all of you here feel the same way and are committed to that, and I thank you.